Thank you both. I don't know how insightful this presentation could be. I just want to talk about George Bernard Shaw. And as I have given you the title, there are a couple of problems that I have come across whenever I have dealt with Shaw. I do teach a little bit of Shaw in the university as well. So when Gautam said Shaw, I thought, yes, why not share some of my misgivings as well as my appreciation about this man who is one of the most celebrated dramatists of the 20th century, and he should be. There is no question why the celebration that we offer is completely justified, because he is changing in a way the entire tenor of 20th century drama, although he is starting to write a little earlier, before 20th century actually begins. And in fact, most of you know that he began his career as a novelist. He wrote 2 novels which were, let's say, not entirely successful. And I would not ask you to read them. And then, of course, he found Ibsen, and his obsession with Ibsen is something that we are all intimately familiar with. Anybody who is even remotely familiar with George Bernard Shaw's works know that Ibsen is a kind of a guiding light that is bringing him into theatre and into the hugely successful playwright for most of his career that he was. And of course, what Shaw is doing, because we are talking about a time which is very, very significant as far as European history is concerned, as far as world history is concerned, but particularly because we end up taking an Eurocentric view, and when we are talking about George Bernard Shaw, we have to adopt that kind of a view. I hope to end on a slightly different note if I have time, but let's say. And what Shaw was looking at was an idea of the world which will be governed by principles which are slightly different than the principles that had been historically established. So he was looking for a world where there would be more human cooperation. There would be a lot of thinkers who would act out of the love for humanity rather than any other motivation, because the history of the world has been motivated by colonialism, it has been motivated by religion, it has been always motivated by economics. But for once, Shaw was thinking that the world can do better, in fact. That was what Shaw was thinking, and Shaw was trying to craft a new idea of the world. Whether that Shavian world would have been good or not is a different question. But Shaw thought that it would be necessary, because life as it was not considered to be good. And at the opening of his, at the beginning of his career, we don't really see Shaw with a conviction which is in any way religious, or it's a moral kind of an idealism, but moral not in any religious sense. Moral in the sense that he is looking for the greater good. That is the idea, and there is no religious basis, but he is finding a kind of faith, not in religion, but in philosophy. Because around 1890 or 1891, Shaw is coming across Nietzsche. And here he is being acquainted with a couple of very significant ideas. One, of course, is the Übermensch idea, the Superman idea, and the other one is the idea of the life force. Now, as you know, Shaw was writing everything not in any random or creatively random kind of a manner. He was moving with a project in mind, because this is a man who did not believe in dramatic creative freedom, because drama is a collaborative effort. Modern drama, as we know, it allows a lot of freedom. Shakespearean drama also allowed a lot of freedom to the producers, to the actors, to the directors. But Shaw is someone who is dictating each and every action, each and every reaction, each and every the detailed set directions that he is giving. So he is in full control of the plays because he has a thesis. And we know his plays are often called thesis plays. These are plays of ideas. And he is looking at many ideas. He is not just looking at one idea or a couple of ideas, but he is looking at almost all the sections of life, all the sections that you can imagine when you are thinking about life, when you are thinking about living, when you are thinking about a good, honest living. And the two words that come, and this is what even A.C. Ward had written when he was writing on Shaw. A.C. Ward, as you know, was thought to be one of the foremost commentators of Shaw. A.C. Ward said that the two concepts that Shaw is basing his work on are the idea of the life force, as I said, and the idea of creative evolution. So these are the two things, and two texts one might mention, because one would definitely be Man and Superman, and the other one would be Back to Methuselah. These are the two texts which stand at the center of this theoretical premise, and the others all move around. I am not going to bore you with a lot of detail about these two texts, but let me just quickly talk about what the ideas that he talks about in his play. I mean, he is dealing with marriage. Candida was in a lot of syllabi recently. Perhaps Candida is also there in some syllabi over the world, in the country or in the state. He's writing a play called The Philanderer, and he's writing a play called Getting Married. So marriage becomes a key factor. He's talking about family life. A play like You Never Can Tell deals with this, not in the Ibsenian A Doll's House kind of a way, because the tenor, the kind of mood that he is adopting is comedy. He understands that the Ibsenian seriousness, which we find in Galsworthy, would not succeed beyond a point. Because we do not go back to Galsworthy, do we? Perhaps to Galsworthy's novels, but not unless you are forced to, who would go back to Justice or Strife or The Silver Box or any of Galsworthy's plays. So, but Shaw lives on because he realized that humor is something that we will always need, something that we will always pay heed to. And in fact, in one of his comments, I think Shaw had said that if I was not this funny, people would have hanged me or something. People would have killed me, because he is writing a lot of things which are essentially against popular opinion. And Shaw was not popular for the entirety of his life. Later on, Shaw's popularity diminished a little. And hence my title, that whether he was the man of destiny or whether he was the devil's disciple, this is something that people could not decide for a variety of reasons. And yes, as I was saying, so family life, he is talking about prostitution. This is Warren's profession. So, and he is definitely talking about politics. If you are interested in politics, the art of politics, what is known as statecraft, I would suggest you take a look at the Apple Cart. Although it's a very, it might be a little fatiguing, because the Apple Cart has huge dialogues, pages after pages of dialogues which are entirely political. Or you might study a play like John Bull's Other Island. So that much he is talking about religion, Androcles and the Lion. He is obviously Saint John. He is writing about Saint John. So he is the current popular word problematizing a lot of concepts. He is talking about class in Pygmalion. I will briefly come back to Pygmalion later on. And of course, he is talking about love. One text is quite enough, because if you think about a play like Arms and the Man, he is entirely basing that on a mock Ruritanian premise. I don't know whether you are familiar with The Prisoner of Zenda, or in Bengali Jhinder Bondi, because The Prisoner of Zenda is a very classic kind of a romance in which you have very gendered roles. You have beautiful women, you have heroines who are unattainable love, which is very almost Elizabethan in its unattainability, and you have dashing heroes, you have fantastic villains who are even more dashing than the heroes, perhaps. If you remember again Jhinder Bonti, then Mayur Bahan would be more dashing than the hero himself. And the classic twin, the mistaken identity, all those ideas. And that brilliant ending that every year the hero would go to Ruritanian borders and leave a rose. So that kind of a romance that was rampant in the Victorian times and later on, even during Shaw's time. And Shaw is speaking against all this. Shaw is showing that humanity does not function like that. Reality does not function like that. You need to be much more realistic. You need to be much more grounded on whatever you are doing, because even in Candida, even in a play like Candida, the idea of this very special romantic love is rejected at the end. And Arms and the Man is a wonderful play. That is one play I would definitely suggest. If you have not read Arms and the Man, please, of course I am talking to the students here. If you have not read Arms and the Man, please do. My students know that I generally do not suggest texts which are boring. So trust me on this. Arms and the Man is a wonderful play. And this thing that when he is talking against romance, he is not only talking against romantic love, he is also talking against the romance that we associate with war, that we associate with violence. So he is also kind of dismantling these romantic ideas and showing a very realistic picture, but in such a humorous way that you can't really object. I mean, if you speak against soldiers, that becomes a huge problem, as you know. But Shaw managed to do that because he was setting it entirely in a comic kind of situation. But let me come back to the idea of the life force. The life force and creative evolution, without getting into too much theory or philosophy. Let me just talk about this. Now, what Shaw says, and a lot of other philosophers of this time and earlier times say, that the idea of the life force is something that takes life forward. Because as they see it, that the world is made of two elements. One is life, the life force, the other one is matter. Matter evolves in a material and in a coordinated way, whereas life force controls our lives, what it means to be human. Because life force makes us human. And what life force does, that it discards old matter. It allows us to reinvent, renew ourselves, and new forms have to be created. Because if you look at the historical location of Shaw, he is writing at a time when the entire English construction, the entire English identity is changing. For one thing, the industrial revolution has happened and everything is now different. A lot of industrialization is there with the railways and better technology. The world has become a smaller place, but the world becoming a smaller place has also introduced new complications because the colonies are now in turmoil. England has already lost America. There is widespread problems in the Indian subcontinent and in other spaces all around the world. So the colonial equation is changing, the economic equation is changing, life, class division, everything as was there, things that Jimmy Porter would be looking back to, those things are changing and they are looking at a new kind of life, but new kind of life. Life does not end. Life never ends. Life is always renewed. So, in a way, the material existence will end. Just like we, at this point of time, are now looking at a different kind of existence, the completely material existence that we had, the completely capitalistic existence that we had. We are now looking at this again very, very commonly and very, very, I don't know how justifiably used term, the new normal. So this new normal was teaching us something. I'm not sure it's teaching us anything anymore or not. Our attention spans are not as good as one may imagine. But this idea of the creative evolution, let me come back to that. It was in 1907, Henri Bergson introduced this idea that life changes in a way that individual speciality, individual superiority can be cultivated, can be formed. This evolution is not an evolution which is a democratic or which is a species-wide. This evolution will happen to some individuals who would become superior and who in turn would lead the rest of the humanity to another kind of existence. So this is not a familiar deterministic kind of idea that there is a flow of evolution, that we all are moving together towards the same kind of a goal, but not even a mechanical kind of a thing, but this is a very individual kind of thing. And this is because if the rest of the world is made of matter, humanity has life force. So the life force will change, and that process would be the creative evolution. And as I said, that when the life matter would change, it would be geometrical, it would be mathematical, but humanity will not change like that. It would be a different kind of change, and some individuals would become better because the purpose is to create the Ubermensch. The purpose is to create the Superman figure. So instead of the entirety of humanity evolving together, it would focus on creating a Superman who would break the paradigm and who would lead by example, who would, it's not always that he would be a leader. He will be beyond morality. He would not be bound by the usual ordinary kind of morality because he would be the Superman. And man, he would be responsible for the advancement of everything, the advancement of civilization. And you see, that is how Shaw is looking at mankind. Mankind is there to take everything forward. Not what it does usually, destroy everything. Mankind is not supposed to do that, but mankind is supposed to have a higher kind of a purpose, to take life forward, to be civilized in the truest sense of the word. And the Superman will break out of these hackneyed, cliched paradigms into which mankind has enclosed itself, and the Superman will show a kind of a light. And of course, there is a problem here, because this is an idea which is very closely related to the much debated idea of eugenics. I'll tell you what eugenics is. I mean, you know what eugenics is, but still let me jog your memory. Because this is targeted advancement, targeted genetic advancement, something that Nazis were trying to do at some point of time. They would be experimenting with genetics, and it can be done in a scientific experimental way, or it can be done through selective breeding, selective mating. So the best people will come together and they will have offspring, they will have children who would have the possibility of being much better than the ordinary. So that is a problem because it lacks compassion. This is a goal towards a better, definitely. But what about the people who are not better? Should they be discarded? Should they be discounted? Should they be regarded as lesser? So this is the problem that this kind of idea has. Of course, Shaw is looking at democracy, and Shaw is writing vehemently against how democracy has been so manipulated that the average workers remain exploited. It's not like democracy has come and made life better for everybody. It's not like that at all. What democracy has done is that democracy has created a new kind of class system, a new kind of, and democracy plus capitalism is creating the entire exploitative paradigm once again with different names. So the difference that we have here is essentially semantic, and it's not an actual hardcore on the ground difference at all. So he is saying that we need to be free of these so-called greedy people, the employers, the Marxist idea of the masters and the workers, that kind of a thing, and the exploitation of the workers thing. So, and what he's looking at is that the number of the workers is much more than the number of the owners. But still there is no issue because the workers are not capable of thinking. If they are capable of, even if they are capable of thinking, they are not thinking. They are quite uninterested, apathetic. They are only busy with the day-to-day life things. So that is one area from which his idea of Superman comes, because not all these people can become Superman. Some people will be able to become Superman, and they will have the, I am not going to use that great responsibility and power and responsibility kind of a thing. They will not have that responsibility, but they will somehow eventually take humanity away from all these injustices, all these false notions that humanity has chained itself within. So that he is looking at. And there is another problem with this thing, is that the position of women. This is, if you ask me, one of the biggest issues that I have with Shaw. We celebrate Shaw's new women, but I need you to think about Shavian women for a while. I mean, if you read Man and Superman, you will know what I am talking about. Because as the way Shaw is constructing his female figures, we see they become obsessed with finding the best names. Just think about it. Raina eventually will choose Bluntschli or Bluntschli, however it's pronounced, because Bloomsbury is a better class of man than Sergius. Luca would choose Sergius over Nicola because Sergius is better than Nicola. Nicola is much more practical, so Nicola would not mind. Nicola is business-minded. Nicola is absolutely bases himself in reality. So he would not mind. He will find some other wife somewhere else. So this kind of role that Shaw is giving women in Pygmalion, we see what is done to Eliza Doolittle. Women become tools for experiment, just objects of experiment, nothing else. And there is no compassion there. And Shaw, of course, is not doing this unconsciously. There is a lot of criticism there as well. But this is something that happens even in Man and Superman. We see, and there the theorization is complete because it's said in so many words that the heroine is looking for this particular hero because this hero is the best mate possible who would give her the best spring. So that kind of idea is hugely problematic. Now, this then was the Shavian idea of reality. Because we talk about realism. Realism, of course, is an ism. It's a literary kind of a tool. But what we have grown to do, how we have conditioned, is to trust realism. And what we fail to do is to look at the reality behind that realism. What kind of reality is that particular realism proposing? So this is the Shavian reality. The idea with eugenics, the idea with creative evolution, with the idea of life force, they have certain things which are appreciable, but they also have these negative points. And what happens is, we kind of look back at Shaw, we kind of look back at Shavian theatre, and we tend to look at only the positives. But criticism is also necessary, particularly from our post-modern and post-colonial locations. We need to ask certain questions, even if they might seem a little uncomfortable. But anyway, what Shaw then was doing, and this is the other issue that Shaw is talking about, renewing, reforming, but he is not talking about reformation. He is not talking about political revolution, at least not in the way Russia would be doing soon enough. Russia would do that very soon, at the beginning of the 20th century. So he is not trying to change the paradigm as such. What he is trying to do is to create a new model for a new individual who would give us a new model again, which would be the right model to follow, but according to Shaw. So, ideal reality strictly according to Shaw. So, realism becomes this complete tool with which Shaw is controlling all the ideas, dictating all the ideas, imposing his own personal worldview, as he has every right to do because these are his plays. But it's an imposition nevertheless. It's not an open-ended thing. It's an imposition, his ideas, his politics, the artist's point of view. And if just think about the prefaces that Shaw is writing, think about the afterwards that Shaw is writing. Shaw knows that his plays would be read as much as seen. When you are going to see a play, if somebody cannot show you a few papers, an introduction, and ask you that you have to read this before you see the play. They can at best give you a program kind of a thing. But Shaw is writing large pieces so that he can actually modulate what people think. Shavian theatre does not give you freedom to think. Shavian theatre tells you what to think. That is one of the major objections that I personally, from my 21st century location, have against Shaw. But it's not a literary objection. It's much more of a personal kind of objection. Of course, we can read Shaw in any way that we wish. There is other thing pre-20th century Shaw, there are three phases that we can see in Shaw's writings. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into a historical kind of a discussion here. When he is beginning to write, like Widowers' Houses, this is Warren's profession he basically plays unpleasant. And even when he is writing plays pleasant, this is 1893 and 1894, 1896 is you never can tell. So that just the last decade of the 19th century, he is writing all that, and he is essentially focusing on certain concepts, social concepts, social quote-unquote evils that we talk about. He's talking about them, and he is basically, if you look at these plays, he is talking about exploitation. He is talking about, a lot of internal conflict. There is not a lot of external conflict involved. And what we see is that it's essentially conquering the self that becomes most important. So Raina must choose to fall in love with Lunch. Raina must choose to reject Sergius somehow. And so on and so forth. So there has to be a personal, individual recognition of the self which will create a superior individual in case of all the protagonists. And they would create examples. And of course, he is talking about original values, not age-old, hackneyed, religious, moralistic values, but values which are original in the sense that they cater to the contemporary time. And the other thing that he does is that he is saying that the individual's perception should be independent. This is slightly ironic because he is not allowing you to have your perception, but he is saying that all individuals should have their own perceptions, which will tell them that the values that they are still valuing are quite often wrong. So that is happening, but in the 20th century we see Shaw becoming much more theoretical as 20th century begins, because in 1902 he is writing Man and Superman, at least is performed, and the Übermensch idea in Man and Superman is definitely the Übermensch idea, the Superman idea that comes into play. The Superman, as I have already told you, is imagined as somebody who is no longer bound by normative morality or laws or rules or certain things like that. He is only motivated by this ambition to change himself, not change society as a whole, but to create a new kind of an idea which would create a new model, as I have already told you. Let me not repeat. And of course, he is writing Nature Barbara, he is writing The Doctor's Dilemma. They are mostly about ethics. Ethics of war, ethics of medicine, ethics of science. So, and you can kind of see how we are shifting from the Victorian to the post-Victorian, not entirely the modern as yet, from the Victorian to the post-Victorian, immediately a post-Victorian kind of a thing. And of course, the Great War is beginning in 1914. It was called the Great War then. It was called the First World War only after the Second World War. So the Great War is changing everything, and his plays like Saint John or Apple Cart, as I have said, they were written around in the 1920s. I think Apple Cart is late 1920s, something like 1929, and Saint John is early 1923 or something like that. But by then he is much more theoretical. If you read these plays, they lack that happier kind of a humor that makes the early plays so very much enjoyable. These are also enjoyable. I'm not saying that these are unenjoyable. I'm not saying that. These are as enjoyable as ever, but they were perhaps a little lighter. They were not as obsessed with the theoretical premises as these later plays are. But uh, the Shavian aura is suffering at this point. I'll tell you why, but before I go to that, let me just talk about Shavian men and Shavian women. See, we kind of, as I said, celebrate the Shavian new women, but let me talk about Shaw's women. Again and again, we see they are human. They are no longer the goddesses that we had in earlier romantic notions. They are not always Nora, as in a doll's house, but they have their own integrity, they have their own sense, perhaps even some kind of choice, and they are practical, they are participating, they are not ornamental. And the other thing that the thing that I have always, I don't know whether I'm right in saying so or not, I have often found them equal to the women that you see in Restoration Comedy of Manners, in their power, not always their wit, but in their power, in their abilities. Uh, if you ask me, I always say that the Restoration Comedy of Manners are underrated. There is a lot to be read in them. But anyway, that's not the point. So, and quite often we see these women as conniving. They are listening at doors, they are manipulating people, they are manipulating, quote unquote, their targets. And as you see Luca in, or Luca in Arms and the Man, and as you see, what does Candida do? You know, this is a question, what does she do? Because she is choosing Morel over Marchbanks, and people say, and the thing that she says is that she is choosing the weaker one. Marchbanks is supposedly the stronger person because he is a poet and he is a romantic. He is not as practical as Morel, but Morel, much more realistic, much more practical, is seen as weak. But some people with not very straight minds, people like me, who are rather twisted, they say that Candida is choosing comfort over uncertainty, because life with Marchbanks would be completely uncertain, but life with Morel is sure, secure. And she is also choosing certainty in the way because she is choosing the life force. She is choosing creative evolution because her combination with Morel is socially better than her combination with Marchbanks. So this is something to think about. You can challenge me as you should challenge me. You should question me on these things. You should think about it and come up with your own ideas. So these women, they are. But the problem that I have is that ultimately all these women, with all their power, with all their glory even, they have this functional role. They have their function in the creative evolution, which is procreation. So ultimately we go back to the old gendered idea that these women are only good for one thing. So just keeping the species, moving the species forward. So that is something which I find very, very objectionable, because there are some wonderful women in Shaw, and Rainer, and all these stories end with these happy couplings. They end with these possibilities of a brighter next generation. So we might not think about that, but that is there somewhere in Shaw's mind, because he is thinking in terms of creative evolution. Definitely he is thinking in terms of that. And of course, if you think about Eliza Doolittle, if you think about Pygmalion, what is happening there? These two men, Henry Higgins is a kind of Superman, because he can do what very few people can do. He can do the impossible, because what he does, he completely declassifies Eliza Doolittle. And it's a very difficult thing to do. He mobilizes, he brings her upward, he conditions her into an existence which she cannot sustain, and he does not care about that. Because for him, she is only an experiment, not even a human being. There is no compassion. This is not My Fair Lady that we are talking about, which will have a Hollywood romantic ending. If you have, those of you have read Pygmalion and you know how it ends, and he is completely blind to her plight, and she ends up marrying unhappily, and there is an afterword to the play which chronicles the unhappiness in a way. So when we talk about Pygmalion, we have this huge problem because she is constructed as the Shavian ideal of a woman who is now ready to participate in creative evolution. But she has no scope of those. She has been trained to look for what is good. She has been trained to look for what is sophisticated, what is quote unquote civilized. But she has not given the agency to choose somebody, and she has to choose just anybody because she has no options. So this is the biggest difficulty that we have with Pygmalion and with Shaw's view of women in general, because I will ask you to rethink if you are thinking that Shaw is doing all that. And in fact, the other play that I need to mention here is Caesar and Cleopatra. Historically, and we know even from Shakespeare that Cleopatra was, even from Chaucer onwards, Chaucer's Legend of Good Women, if you think about it, Cleopatra is somebody whom we have had a lot of respect for. But Shaw is changing Cleopatra. Shaw is turning Cleopatra into this petulant child. She is very young, hardly beyond her teens. And Caesar becomes this old, austere kind of a man who is, again, a Superman. And this is a huge problem. I am not going to deal with this anymore, but I just, what I always try to do is to introduce you to the problems, not give you the solutions, because there is no fun in that. You should be able to solve these yourselves. And the idea of original morality comes in even here. And Cleopatra is somehow reduced to something completely, to me, unacceptable. But anyway, and so this is how Shaw is dealing with his women, whereas he's turning his men into Superman. The concept of a superwoman never comes into play. Never. His men, if you see that they are outspoken, they are very practical, they are blunt, hence bluntly. So they are very blunt, they are very, in one way, unromantic. They are traditionally unromantic, but they are creating their own new paradigm of romance. So they are doing everything. They are familiar with technology. In Man and Superman, there is this whole issue about a car. Automobiles were a very new and a very, people were rather suspicious of automobiles at that point of time. And they are not perfect, but perfect within their imperfections. So these are the things that Shaw is giving his men, because he is, as I said, he is not making them perfect, but the men that we the men that we see are in the process involved. They are within the process of evolution. They are evolving into Superman. So that's the men that we see. That is why we need that entire Don Juan in Hell segment in Man and Superman. The process, the recognition, which will create, which will turn them into Superman. And in fact, if we, these men in The Devil's Disciple, we have this unlikely hero, and the Man of Destiny, we see Napoleon being bested by an English woman in a way, but again, that is early, that is a different kind of a thing. Even there, the woman's agency is questionable in a way. But see, the point is then that Shaw is imposing all these strictures, Shaw is creating these new paradigms. But in these new paradigms, the gendered roles are, as I said, very gendered. There is no scope for a woman to take a progressive or post Nora. This is a little surprising how Shaw is bracketing many of his women, in many of his female protagonists in such terms. And this imposition of his ideas is another thing, although Shaw was politically very significant. And I told you that during his later years he was not as, his aura had suffered, that is the phrase I had used. He was involved with the Fabians. He was very important because he was a part of the establishment of the Labour Party in England. So politically he was very, very significant. During the Great War, he had spoken against both sides. He was anti-war. So people did not like that. So the Shavian thing was slowly subsiding. And in fact, he was a socialist in many ways, and the Soviet construct was something that he was very enthusiastic about. And that again is something that the West did not like. But anyway, he was given a Nobel Prize in 1925. I will end with one point that that it has nothing to do with Shaw the dramatist, but it has something to do with us. Shaw, as I said, won the Nobel Prize in 1925. He had been eyeing the Nobel Prize for a while, I guess. He wanted to win the Nobel Prize, and many people want to win the Nobel Prize, so that's not a problem. Someone from the colonies won the Nobel Prize in 1913, and Shaw was not entirely happy about that. In fact, he was so unhappy that in 1932 he wrote this book called The Adventures of the Black Girl in Her Search for God and Some Lesser Tales. This is the name of the book, a bunch of short tales and stories, short stories. So in this book, there is a figure of a man. The black girl is going all around the globe, meeting different people who having various adventures which are mostly satirical, meeting exaggerated men, meeting men who are not reliable entirely. And she meets a man who looks like a sage or something like that. And this man is called, named in his story, Stupendranath Beggar. So this Stupendranath Beggar is quite obviously a remark at Rabindranath Tagore. And this is something that kind of takes a little flavor away from Shaw. When you know that this is, although the text is a different thing, the author is a different thing. I believe in the death of the author, separation of the text and the author. But when you know that Shaw was a meme like that, it takes a little respect away from the man, at least as far as I am concerned. That it shows how colonial even George Bernard Shaw was, and how many characters from the colonies do you see in his? He was very political. I mean, he was talking about Irish independence and all that, but the colonies were very much there when he is writing. The colonial issues were very much there, but Shaw is not going beyond Europe. So this entire thing, as I began, the whole Eurocentric idea remains he's not supposed to. I mean, it's not his responsibility to do any of become colonial or right in a post-colonial manner. But still, the reality that we see is a limited reality. It's a Eurocentric reality. It's not a reality that encompasses the entire world, but only the colonial center of the world. Thank you. That is where I end.